Okay, it's time to start. And this is actually the final session of the conference after the closing ceremony, and also the final session of the EHERO GLO special sessions on happiness economics. We have 4 presenters in this session, and these presenters are Carol Graham, Kelsey O'Connor, Julia Schmidtke, and Kasper Kaiser. And in these special sessions, the presenters also have a discussant. And the discussant has already read the paper in depth. And after the presentation of the presenters, the discussant will have a separate presentation to discuss the paper in 5 minutes. After which, if we have time, we open the floor for a general discussion. So I want to ask the presenters to present within 15 minutes, and I will give a sign 2 minutes before. And then there's 5 minutes for the discussant and hopefully 5 minutes for general discussion. So we can start with Carol. Is Carol already here? No, I don't see Carol yet. Okay, then we'll start with the second presentation. That will be Kelsey.
Oh, sorry, wrong slides. Let me. Apologize, 1 second. There it is. All right, that looks right. Okay. So you can see here from the title that what we're going to do is look at the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're going to look at the whole year. And we're going to do that using Twitter data. This is joint work with Francesco Saracino, Talita Grayling, who's joined us, Chiara Peroni, and Stephanie Rousseau. And we'll get started with an example of why this is important. From the recent World Happiness Report, 2021, there's a quote I've shown here. Using the data from all 95 countries, life evaluations showed an insignificant increase from 2017, 2019, this is an average, to 2020. Given how all lives have been so importantly disrupted, it is remarkable that the averages are so stable. So what they're doing here is they're drawing a conclusion about what's happened in 2020, and they're doing it from the Gallup World Poll. But the Gallup World Poll is fielded once during the year. If you look at the figure on the right, this is gross national happiness. This is our data, and it is, in this case, the average of 7 European countries and throughout the whole year. If you see right in the middle of March, right after lockdown and kind of the onset of the pandemic in Europe, there was a huge decrease in gross national happiness. Whereas, so if you go approximately a little over a month later, the value has come back up. So depending upon when the survey was fielded, you could get very misleading results about what happened in the year in response to the pandemic. So an advantage of this gross national happiness index is that we have daily data, which can be used to track changes throughout the year. More specifically, it's also produced in a real-time way. So if you go online to, I think it's gnh.today, this is Talita's website, the index is produced every hour, and so it can be used by decision makers for frequent and rapid insight into what's happening in the population. So it was initiated by Talita and Stephanie for South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. And this project extended it to include 7 European countries: United Kingdom, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, France, Spain, Italy. I know some of you may not consider the UK Europe anymore, but I'm thinking of the continent, not EU strictly. So we also extended it to develop new variables: economic fear, trust in national institutions, and loneliness, coming still from Twitter. So this is a nice new addition. If I have some time, I'll describe how some of that is done. And it's obtained using sentiment analysis. I think some of you are familiar with this, and I have some detail included at the end, but for sake of time, I'll skip it right now. But essentially it uses natural language processing to determine whether or not a tweet is positive, negative, or neutral, and then that's going to be aggregated up to the geographic unit and time unit. A question naturally arises, is this valid and reliable, especially when we're going to aggregate it up to the national level? Twitter is clearly not nationally representative, so we must test this to see, how valuable is this information that we're receiving. So first, I want to indicate that there have now been 5 published or forthcoming papers using gross national happiness by Talita, Stephanie, and colleagues from journals from PLOS ONE to our own ISQual's journal, Applied Research and Quality of Life. So this it means there should be at least 10 peer reviewers who have signed off on the information coming from this. However, these papers, as far as I understand, are based mostly in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, and they're largely tweeting in English. So one of the things that's occurring in the European countries, as you can imagine, is the tweets are in various languages. Say in Germany, it's going to be dominantly German. So what we do is we do some further tests, and this gives you an idea here. So across the left, you have GNH, our gross national happiness, and across the bottom, you have the Eurobarometer life satisfaction score. And we just take GNH for the period in which the Eurobarometer was fielded. And you see that there's a decent correlation here. It's not perfect. In terms of rank, it's about 0.32. If you exclude Italy, it improves a bit. It's not statistically significant, but there are only a few countries. So we have done several additional tests, however. So here is just kind of a summary. This first one is, you see it's a 0.48, statistically insignificant. Just as also, again, a cross-section across countries. So here we have all 10 countries, and we compare it with the Cantor ladder from the World Happiness Report. There is one negative correlation here, which shouldn't be negative. And this is based on life satisfaction from more of a convenience sample in 4 countries. So given it is a convenience sample, we're not as worried about it, but it's, doesn't bode super well. In the other studies, so we look at Google, aggregate up. So this is similar to what was done in the keynote of Nick Powderby. And we come up with an index here, and we get a negative correlation, which is what we expect because this is negative search. And then we have another positive, correlation that we would expect. And this is with consumer confidence in the 7 European countries. Additionally, our other variables I mentioned, so economic fear, you might think economic fear and consumer confidence are more similarly related, and indeed our correlation improves. Trust in national institutions, this is additional variable we created, and trust in government from the Eurobarometer, very highly correlated. So, and another high correlation, these last 2 are just cross-section, but the first one is over time. So this does suggest that we have a fairly meaningful process to develop, measures. Stated here, GNH exhibits, in my mind, a meaningful level of correlation with different measures of subjective well-being. And this is what we call convergent validity. And if you go back to the OECD 2013 measuring well-being, they discuss what kind of measures, correlations that they're looking for to determine validity and reliability. And you might be surprised, we're actually doing really well. 0.3 is fairly high, especially given that these are different measures. GNH is capturing what is referred to as a valuative mood, whereas life satisfaction, is a cognitive global evaluation. They're distinct. Yet we still have, in the case of the Cantor ladder, a fairly high correlation. So what about variation over 2020? This is probably what you're most interested in. Is it actually explained by expected factors like infection rates and lockdown measures? And this is also a representation of construct validity. So let's take a look what happened to gross national happiness during the pandemic. And here you have 2 figures. So again, I focused on the European countries just for brevity. So this is the average in the European countries' gross national happiness across the left. And in this first figure, you have the new cases. You have the first peak and the second peak. I think many of you will remember this. In the second figure, you have the stringency of lockdown measures, or containment policies, in this case, coming from Oxford's index. And here you see that there does seem to be a correlation. The timing's not perfect. There again does seem to be a correlation. The peak and trough are fairly well matched. The trend here is downward, the trend here is upward. In the lockdown measures, on the other hand, it does look like it was extremely important in the first part, but then afterwards, the correlation seems to break down. So what we'll do, of course, is put this all together in a regression framework. So here we have the regressions. First, just our basic regression. We have the standard kind of controls. We have the different seasons, which are going to reflect weather, and which I think is going to be particularly important in the case of lockdown measures, so you can go outside and perhaps enjoy the weather. And also it's going to reflect cases to some degree. And lag G&H representing or reflecting that we really have time series. And indeed, look at the autocorrelation is really high. So just these variables also have month controls. All 10 countries are included. We have more than 80% of the variation explained. Adding in some of the more interesting ones. So what this is, IHS is this inverse hyperbolic spline. So this is going to be like the change. So this is basically like the change in log new cases. So this is statistically significant and negative, as we'd expect. Residential mobility, this is actually staying at home. So in fact, people staying at home is positively correlated with G&H. So I was thinking this, is reflecting lockdown, that this would be negative, but in fact, it's positive. Here we get a little bit of a unexpected result. So this is the future increase in stringency. So this is anticipated increase, and this is anticipated decrease. So we allow stringency to be basically its impact to be asymptotic, so these lockdown measures, and then it's the anticipation. And they both show up to be negative. However, that's going to change in the next slide. Just bringing it all in, these results basically hold. Yeah. So and then what we had to do is drop one of the months when we include the mobility data, and this is just showing that it's essentially robust. Okay, so here now we're going to add in additional controls, basically just these emotions. So one of the things that the G&H project with the LIDA is producing are 8 underlying emotions. You can see them here. And what we've done is we've thrown them all in initially, and we're going to drop them as we progress. But first note, when you do that, the lag G&H term does decrease. So we are getting a lot of explanatory power coming out of this. It's not just a persistence that's working here. Also, now this coefficient is no longer statistically significant. It's now what we expect. So when you expect an increase or greater lockdown measures next week, it negatively impacts or is negatively related to your well-being, whereas this has no longer an impact. Surprise is positively related, but as you can imagine, there's going to be a great deal of collinearity here. So what I did is I dropped variables that the emotions that basically had a high p-value. Note that these are bootstrapped values, so they're not standard errors. So it's a little bit different because I had to use, we clustered on country and we have a small number of countries. So after eliminating the emotions that weren't statistically important, we have disgust that remains, surprise, fear, although not statistically significant, it's about a 0.2 p-value, trust is almost significant. Then when we move over, what we do here is we drop Luxembourg because unfortunately these variables, economic fear, national trust, and loneliness, we were unable to produce them for Luxembourg because there's just too few people tweeting in Luxembourg, too few tweets per day and per week to be able to aggregate that up. So we just move across by, I show you what it looks like when we change the sample. Trust becomes significant. And unfortunately, these variables, which we were really interested in, part of the project was intended just to produce these variables, but they do not show up to be statistically significant once you include all of these other variables. And mobility remains significant throughout. This is staying at home. Cases maintain significance. and then anticipating an increase in lockdown is significant. So this brings us to the conclusion. I have a couple extra slides depending on time, but conclusion for now. Sentiment analysis applied to tweets provides frequent, timely, and meaningful well-being data. We had large swings in GNH that occurred rapidly around March. So an infrequent, say an annual survey could get the outcome wrong depending on when it was fielded. So the GNH adds here. And more than 80% of the variation in gross national happiness was throughout 2020 can be explained just by the persistence in lag GNH, the seasons and month controls. Increasing new cases and anticipated increases in the severity of lockdown measures are both related to lower GNH, as you might expect. And people appear to like staying at home. This is based on the Google mobility data, which is positively related to GNH. The most important emotions that we measured include disgust, surprise, and trust, and they're related to GNH in the way in which you would expect. Surprisingly, economic fear, and economic fear is a way to capture, not just let's say unemployment, but also changes in income, changes in savings. So we were really hopeful for this variable, but unfortunately didn't come through. And trust in national institutions, also there's a lot of research suggesting that is particularly relevant right now for people choosing to take the vaccine or not. Loneliness, I think, is fairly straightforward as well. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. We can now go to the discussion comments by Casper.
I'm trying to set things up, but I'm slow in doing this. 1 second.
I see we're still missing Carol. I hope everything's all right.
Carol is emailing, so I'm trying to get her in now. For some reason, she cannot enter the session, so now we try it in a different way. So she's trying, and she will be here soon.
Okay.
I will have to. My computer tells me that I have to quit and reopen Zoom in order to share my screen. So I will be back in 1 second. I'm really sorry about this. I don't know.
It might be another faster solution. Martin might make you co-host. That was my solution for my sessions when I got this. If you make the presenter, co-host, then it's going faster to avoid these problems. Meanwhile, may I ask a spontaneously question what I was thinking while we are waiting?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very, very good presentation for interesting analysis. I am thinking about, I'm not questioning the method. I'm trying spontaneously to come with something else. If you do the analysis of frequently used words, which are not part of the sentimental analysis, I was thinking maybe especially during these times when are coming up very frequent words might tell us something, like the first big use when Google predict the peak of flu peak in United States before the epidemiologists did with their models. Did you understand my question? I'm thinking about statistics. If you have numbers about the most frequent words, and especially if they're coming this kind of keywords, like people are looking for different types of vaccines, for example. And
so one thing is, you have what Google, you use Google Trends to see the most commonly searched terms in a particular area and time. And then the tweets could also be assessed on the frequency of words. It's not something that we have set up at this point.
That I was expecting. I told you it was a spontaneous idea because I thought that we have that time. Please take over the discussion. Thank you for letting me asking.
Sure.
I don't need to cut off any discussion. But maybe because I think I will raise similar things, and I'm sorry for the delay. I got a new computer and I'm not yet entirely sure how this thing works. So that being said, Kelsey, thank you so much. I actually had sent Francesco my slides in order to warn him about my criticism, but silly me didn't realize that you would be the one presenting. So now you will be unprepared. So first of all, on the good stuff. So I think this data that you're having is amazing and should be used much more frequently. And I think this is just where the field will have to go to in the space from now until in 20 years. I don't think anybody's going to use survey data in 20 years. So that's definitely the right direction. Another thing that I think makes total sense is that you're addressing a question that's key to the theme of this conference, and that's pretty much key to what subjective well-being research should contribute to the social science literature in times of COVID. Another thing that I really liked was the fact that you're not looking at a single country, because there's some other studies, for example, by Mark Fabian and co-authors that did a sort of similar thing with the UK using Google Trends data. So you might want to look at that. But I like that you push it further, going to, what was it in the end, 10 countries. And I like the fact that you are trying to validate in some way this data too, because as you might know, I'm fairly obsessed with the meaning of the data that we're using, especially when it's about subjective stuff. That being said, and now we get to my three key worries, and then I've got a bunch of nitty-gritty things that you might want to address at some later point. I have three major things. So the first one is, okay, in the paper, you sort of stress the validity test as a key contribution. But then in the main text, they don't actually turn up anywhere. They're all put to the appendix. And I feel like if you're stressing this just in terms of framing your paper, then I feel that the validity test should just be right at the start of your results section. And then I thought, when I was looking at it, especially your life satisfaction sort of validation test, I think more is feasible with the available data. I think you can do more than the convenience sample that you have. And the sort of ranking of countries idea. And in particular, these large-scale surveys like SERP or European Social Survey or Eurobarometer, they have the exact date of the interview, right? So you can actually correlate the mean level of say, life satisfaction or happiness with the actual mean responses on particular days. Now, if you were to do this with US data, then you could, of course, use the Gallup data poll and have a lot more power. But I think that the GNH is not yet available for the US. Another thing is what I think you could do if it's available, if in your Twitter data you have more fine-grained regional data, then you can do this sort of ranking thing, but now you do it on say, nuts regions, right? And so you get more power. And then generally, I'm not fully convinced of these validity tests. Like you show a rank correlation that's sort of weak. The overtime data from Luxembourg doesn't really show validity. And essentially everywhere where your validity test works, it isn't the sort of classical subjective well-being stuff that we're interested in. So that's a bit of a concern, but I'm not generally sure whether we should focus on life satisfaction here or better on happiness. So that's another thing. Second thing is, I read the paper, and by the end of the paper, I still don't know how this GNH is generated. And given that you frame the paper as, this is a methodological contribution, we're using the super cool data, I think it's key for the reader to understand what's going on with that and how exactly your sentiment analysis works, how the algorithm precisely works, so that I don't have to go to grading 2019 and read it up on there, because I want to know while I'm reading that paper. In the appendix is fine, but it needs to be somewhere, I think. And then final point, I think more could be done with the high temporal granularity that you have. So I was already surprised that you're aggregating up to 2 weeks when you in fact have daily data. But more generally, I think that you can do quite a lot with lags and leads and have some maybe even some sort of lasso procedure where you search for the right leg length and lead length, because I think it's really key in this whole COVID thing about what people anticipate and what happened in the past. And I think so much more could be done, and that's the key advantage that you have with your data over the more traditional survey designs. So I really think that you could do more there with sort of temporal analyses. Now then I have a bunch of nitty-gritty things, but I just sent you the slide, and then if things are unclear, it's yeah, you can ask, or yeah, we have something else. How much time do I have? Should I better stop? Otherwise I would have some general points about, you know, this sort of data, but maybe it's better to open up the discussion.
Yes, we can maybe do one question. If someone has a question. I don't see any raised hands, so if you want, you can do this, provide some additional comments, and then we move on to the next presenter.
Maybe it would be even better if Kelsey has thoughts, given that he's in a much better position to give thoughts than I am. I'd be interested in that.
So thank you, Casper. We spent quite a bit of time, you know, thinking about this and working on it. And, you know, if you remember the keynote speech by Nick yesterday, right, they didn't try to validate it all. You know, and I think most of the papers aren't trying to validate. So I think, you know, it's really a challenge. And you're right, I did frame this presentation differently than the paper. The paper was written very rapidly to meet a deadline and hasn't been revised since. And you'll notice that there are typos in there, you know, it has some limitations. So, you know, one of the things that you mentioned, you know, I like, you know, say using the SOP and the fielding date specifically. And the Eurobarometer data, actually, as an example, we don't have the field date because we don't have the microdata yet. And that's actually part of the power, right, of what we have. So, you know, if we want to do this if we want to do a methodological paper, then we wait a year until we get the microdata and we can do exactly what you suggested and we can improve upon it. Also, you know, one of the reasons why we did aggregate up to the weekly level, at least in the case of Luxembourg, is, you know, some of our data really just has some measurement error. You know, because Luxembourg has only approximately 300 tweets a day. And, you know, so we get it up to the week long, we have, you know, 2,100. And, you know, so that's one aspect. So I was a little bit more comfortable doing that. You know, so, and then some of the other variables also, the searches on Google, when we were looking at that, the mobility, I also wanted to remove some of the volatility that I thought it was basically, we are getting more noise than signal, you know, in that variable. But you're right. I mean, the power of this, and one of the things that Talita and Stephanie really appreciate in the data is that, you know, you can see that people are happier on Fridays than they are on Mondays, you know. So so it's a little bit of a different focus. You know, so I appreciate this, and I look forward to looking at the slides and trying to address some of these in a little bit more detail. Also, you know, how G&H is actually constructed, this sort of stuff. I agree with you. And I'll say just one last thing. Yeah, we weren't sure what this paper was initially. We wanted to be able to refer to it in second papers so that we could say, all right, this is what was done. We did the validation in the first paper, but at the same time, we needed to speak about what happened, you know, during the pandemic. So it probably should be two separate papers, you know, as you're suggesting, in some degree. So yeah, thank you for. I look forward to reading the slides in more detail, and hopefully I addressed your points, at least initially.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we need to move on to the next presentation. I see that Daniela still has a question for Kelsey, but can you please ask it via the chat, and Kelsey can answer via the chat. Okay, then we move to the presentation of Casper. Also because Carol is still not in.
Yeah, Martijn, I might try calling her. So
yeah. I provided her the details of the eSqualls account, so she's trying it now via the eSqualls account.
Okay.
It should work, but you can, yeah, maybe you can call her, yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Now you are, I was of course thinking that I would be the very last person, so now I will panic for a second and then we can start. Thanks all for coming. So this will be based on old boring survey data, but I think data that seems to be just generally underutilized, and I hope I can at least convince you of that. So the paper is joint work with Ji-Hoon Han from Zhejiang University. He should actually take most of the credit for it because he was the one that sort of dug out some of the data and did most of the data analysis. But unfortunately, it's now like 2 a.m. where he's based, so I'll be the one presenting. So what are we going to talk about? Time use and happiness and evidence across 3 decades. So we have, after having looked through the data, I think there's sort of 2 post-hoc research questions emerging. And the first one is whether there are interesting historical trends in diary-based happiness data. And the second one, whether sort of what we see in time-weighted happiness measures, and I'll explain what I really mean by this, and life satisfaction driven by the same determinants. And given that research question, you can probably already guess the answer that we come up with. So what do we use in terms of data? Well, we're using on the one hand a data set that I haven't seen used yet, and that's the American Use of Time project from 1985, along with the well-being module of the American Time Use Survey, which has been used more. And both of these data sets have diaries with data on the type and timing of individual activities, so what people did on a given day, as well as levels of happiness and enjoyment within each activity, and then a bunch of standard demographics, so we can run regressions. So specifically, the 1985 survey asked for every activity where a person recorded her diary, the level of enjoyment. So how much did you enjoy that activity? And it's recorded on a 0 to 10 scale. And then the well-being module of the American Time Use Survey has data on a 6-point scale or 7-point scale on happiness. There's also other feelings, but we're here focusing on happiness because we think that enjoyment and happiness at least are close enough as concepts to jointly analyze that data and make sort of a pseudo-repeated cross-section out of that. In addition, we're also using data where we only have time use data. So that's from 1994, 1995, and then from 2003 again. And we also do robustness tests with, we do the entire analysis again with UK data, but I'm not going to show you results on that because the results are very similar. Where especially this Unilever 1986 survey, again, doesn't seem to have been used, at least in the economic literature. So now, but we have this problem, right? Because for the 85 data, we have a 11-point scale, and for the 2010 data, we have a 7-point scale. So what we do is we essentially collapse both scales into a common 3-point scale and try to ensure that the distribution of enjoyment and happiness is stable over time. So when we look at the distribution, so this is, I hope you can see my mouse cursor. So this is the 1985 original distribution on the enjoyment variable. And then after the collapse, we get this distribution and those 2 distributions. So when we're now looking at 2013, those 2 are made to be equal. You will also notice that compared to sort of life satisfaction data or more standard happiness data, like the one you might observe in SERP, these distributions are really quite unusual. For example, in 2013, having this bunching around the 6s. So there's already quite some difference that I thought was surprising when I'm first looking at that data. But the time use experts in the room would probably tell me that this is old news, but it wasn't for me. So you might think, okay, but the way you're collapsing this, that's probably spurious and it doesn't really work. So what we did is we had 2 robustness tests where we reran essentially the entire analysis. One was we're using ordered probit regressions, and instead of collapsing the data, we are now just imposing just one common threshold. So we impose that what a 3 in 1985 is the same level of well-being as a 2 in 2010. And apart from that, we impose nothing, and then we still get identification. And the other one is we dichotomize over all possible levels that would still get the same distributions. And we generally get roughly the same results when we do these robustness tests. So how do we categorize these activities? Well, we have 13 broad categories. So we have market work, we have domestic work, we have shopping, we have traveling, we have eating, we have out-of-home leisure, then we have separately watching TV, that's also separate from in-home leisure. Then we have social care, which we call here care for children or adults. We have education, civic activities, personal care, and sleeping. So that's actually based on a much larger set of 96 activities, but in order to make the analysis manageable and sort of interpretable, we broke it down into those 13 categories. And then because there are these unobservable factors that might affect both the choice of what a person does and what that person's happiness level is, we use an individual fixed effects model. So we have to run some tricks in order to probe it, but I think we can still get at a fixed effects model. And so what we're essentially then interested in is less the individual fixed effect, but more these betas, which essentially indicate the level, the fixed effects cleaned level of happiness with each activity J at time T for a particular group G, where most of the time we're making just a distinction between men and women, apart from some subgroup analysis. And in order to make sure that any time trends aren't driven by sort of changes in the composition of the US population, we create weights based on age, education, and marital status. I hear noises. And yeah, marital status to keep the composition of the sample constant over time with respect to these demographic characteristics. So first set of results that are purely descriptive, but that I also already thought were kind of interesting. So first of all, just descriptively, like with what activities are people actually happy and which activities do people dislike? And so what you have in the dark gray is always in 2013, and in the lighter color, it's in white is 1985. And so in 2013, what we actually find for men is that they're most happy while doing social care, which is essentially either caring for other adults or being with their children. Second is out of home leisure, and the third one is indoor leisure. So essentially, men like either social care, which I thought was surprising, or leisure. With women in 2013, it's a bit different. There's religious and civic activities, out of home leisure, and social care. Now, what do people like least? For men, it's actually education, market work, and shopping. And for women, it turned out to be market work, shopping, and domestic work. So the differences aren't too great. Over time, what has happened between 1985 and 2013, a couple of activities became more enjoyable, and some activities became less enjoyable, and that's true for both genders. So, for example, in-home leisure, eating, and TV were all activities that lost quite a bit of enjoyability over time, whereas shopping, education, and I thought interestingly, market work, traveling, social care, but most strikingly down here, domestic work actually it became a lot more enjoyable. So maybe that's a change in technology, that since 1985, doing work at home has become more enjoyable and more of a leisure thing. But yeah, okay, that's a first sort of look at it. That's and then we thought, okay, but have these changes in time use been driven by happiness? So by intuition, and I suppose you could develop some theory there, which we haven't done yet, is that, you know, as economic constraints are lifted, people should tend towards activities that are more enjoyable. And so essentially what we did is we regressed the change in how much time people spend on each type of activity on the happiness score in 2013. And although we see these slight positive coefficients or trend lines, these are all insignificant. And when instead of doing it with the 13 activity codes, we do it with quite a lot of activity codes, with 46, we see the same result, that essentially these changes are insignificant. So people don't tend towards doing those sorts of things that make them happier as economic constraints are being lifted over time. So we might just be very inefficient at doing the things that make us happy, and that I thought was really quite surprising. Now, to look at trends over time, we need to look at both changes in time use and changes in activity level happiness. And so that's what we do by constructing a measure of time-weighted happiness at time t for group G, which is just you sum over all activities J. You take the happiness effect that we estimated from the previous regression and weight it by the time people spend on a particular activity. So, and then you have for each group, in our case, men and women, in each period, sort of the level of happiness weighted by the time that they spent in each activity. When we look at this time trend, where we have data for 1985, we have data for 2010, and then we again have it for 2012 to 13, and all other cases we interpolate, we see essentially that men gained relative. Women gained relative to men, and that's a significant gain. So there's an increasing gender gap in time-weighted happiness over time, and that's, I thought, was quite surprising. Is completely opposite to the results based on more standard data like the General Social Survey, for example, well-known paper by Stevenson and Wolfers that find exactly the opposite. That since the 1980s, women lost relative to men with respect to sort of their happiness measure. So either our results are wrong or their results are wrong. But insofar as we're weighting objectively over time, where Stevenson and Wolfers use sort of the standard measure that might be subject to sort of cognitive biases, I would trust our results more. But obviously I'm biased. How much time do I have left?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, no, then I will do this one now, because I think this one is important. Because we thought, okay, what might this be driven by? Might this be driven by changes in how happy people are within each activity, or is this driven by changes in time use? And so what we can do is we can sort of decompose the effects into either channel. And when we do that, we find that pretty much most of the effect of this increasing gender gap between men and women is driven by changes in time use. Essentially, women since 1985 are increasingly selecting into activity or able to select into activities that are more enjoyable, more so than men. So if we were to impose common activity level happiness and only let time use differ, then women were quite a lot less happy in 1985, but then overtook men by 2013. I will skip this. I will skip this. And then, so what I skipped, we essentially found that across subgroups, people, our results on the levels didn't conform at all to standard life satisfaction measures. So what we thought is, okay, we should really just regress standard demographics on our time-weighted happiness data and on our life satisfaction data, which we have available in the same sample, and see whether the results match up. Essentially, that's what's shown in this table. And essentially what we find is that for being married, for the age effect, where we would always expect sort of a U shape in age, for having children, we reproduce the standard results as in life satisfaction. So married people have a greater time-weighted happiness, and they're also more satisfied with their lives. But two variables where this didn't work out at all, and that's essentially income and employment. And on the employment unemployment thing, there's been some results. I mean, most well known, I think, the Economic Journal paper from 2010 from on German data by Andreas Knabe and I think others, who show that essentially the unemployed aren't less time-weighted happy than the employed. And we see this again, but we also see this for income, that essentially as incomes increase, time-weighted happiness doesn't increase at all. I think that's best shown by this picture, where here on the left, we have family income, time-weighted happiness on the y-axis, and essentially we see no relationship between family income and time-weighted happiness, whereas for life satisfaction, we find the standard sort of diminishing marginal returns. So what's the upshot of that? The upshot is time-weighted happiness bears very little relation to the two key sort of economic variables, unemployment and income, in a very different way than is the case for life satisfaction. And to me, that tells me that if you're some sort of utilitarian planner and you think either time-weighted happiness or life satisfaction matters, you really have to decide which of the two matters. And I think we need much more discussion on that, rather than sort of saying, as is typically done, effect-based measures and cognitive measures give sort of the same results. Because if you're using the diary data, it seems that the results differ quite a lot when you're looking at economic outcomes. And I think I will just leave it at that here.
Yeah, thank you, Casper. Then we will now go to your discussant, which is Julia.
Yes, I'm trying to share my slides.
Yeah,
But this will stop sharing your slides, Casper.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it worked. So please let me know if it does not work. So just great. Just a quick summary of the main results. We heard the paper just a few minutes ago. You show that using data from national time use surveys, how the association
and perhaps gains.
Yeah, I don't know why it stops. I don't know.
Oh, I think I'm trying to start it again. I am Jill Johnson for this session because it was the only way I could sign in, and I must have touched something that stopped the recording, but now I'll have to figure out how to start recording. I'm basically screwing the entire session up as far as I can tell. Just do what?
It's recording now.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Right, it is okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Been on Zoom too much today, obviously.
Yeah. So we have two presentations left. First, we go to Julia for her presentation.
Okay, just let me share my screen again. Okay, so yes, I'm going to show or present to you a paper about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the mental health and subjective well-being of workers in Germany. And this is joint work with Clemens Hetschko, who is also here in the call today, and Ronny Schöp, Gesine Stephan, Michael Eid, and also Mario Naves. So since its outbreak in China at the end of 2019, the virus has spread rapidly across the globe and changed life drastically. Governments introduced unprecedented restrictions to people's private and working lives, and they were often accompanied by severe economic impacts. So, of course, the effects of the pandemic on individual well-being have been of a great concern right from the beginning of the outbreak. And so far, studies overwhelmingly find a negative impact of COVID-19 on the mental health and also on subjective well-being. However, those existing studies often face some methodological challenges. Some of them lack a pre-event measure since they started data collection only during the pandemic, when the first infection waves already started. Or they compare different samples, like samples drawn before and after the pandemic, which might not be comparable to one another. And sometimes there's also a large time lag between individual interviews. So what we do is, in this paper, we address those methodological challenges, and we try to contribute to the existing literature by using novel monthly panel data of German workers over the years 2019 and 20, to estimate the effects of the pandemic on well-being. And what we are able to do is that we compare the well-being during the pandemic relative to a within-person reference level of well-being before the pandemic. So with our high-frequency data, we then are really able to zoom in on changes in well-being around crucial events of the pandemic, like when first cases emerged, when lockdowns were introduced, and also when restrictions were lifted. We analyze various indicators of well-being for different subgroups, and we also try to answer new questions that arise now with multiple infection waves over several years, since most of the existing literature still focuses on the first lockdown or first infection waves. So we try to answer the question if people return to pre-pandemic levels of well-being after infections rise and decline and curbs are introduced and then lifted, and also if the second wave of the pandemic is experienced as more or less harmful than the first wave. And we do this by using the German job search panel. And this panel was initially aiming at measuring the impact of job search on well-being. And that is why we contacted employed job seekers who registered at the German Federal Employment Agency in advance to their expected termination of employment. And our recruitment process went from 2017 until May 2019, and our individuals are then aged from 18 to 60, and they participated in the monthly surveys via smartphone app for up to 2 years. And our experience is that they typically drop out of the survey within the first 3 months, or if they don't, then they participate for many more months to come. And this is why we are actually able to analyze the effects of COVID-19, even though we stopped the recruitment process in May 2019. To just say a few words about our sample selectivity, at the time of the first lockdown in March in 2020 in Germany, most participants are employed. And that means that they either found a new employment or that they actually never entered unemployment because, for example, their limited contract got prolonged. Our panel also oversampled individuals who encountered a mass layoff or a plant closure. And we do this because those events usually affect a large variety of people, irrespective of socio-demographic characteristic and job attributes. So this actually should limit our sample selectivity. So we look at many different indicators of well-being, starting with mental health. And for this, we use a shared German version of the Center of Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale, which comprises of 15 items on how often individuals experience feelings of failure, of strain, of anxiety, etc. in the last week. And we calculate an average over those single items. We also look at life evaluation by using the satisfaction with life scale, which comprises of 5 items. And we also look at satisfaction with specific domains of life, namely job, leisure satisfaction, satisfaction with family life, and also with household chores. Last, we also employ momentary mood assessment by using the experience sampling method, and we use the short version of the multidimensional mood state questionnaire for this. And in our survey, then participants indicate at 6 random points in time during 1 day of the month how happy or unhappy, how awake or sleepy, or how calm or restless they are in this precise moment. To then facilitate the comparison of those effects across the study outcomes, we transformed all our indicators into POM scores. And this is really a really simple transformation, as you can see on the slide. And the result of it is basically that now all our indicators range from 0 to 100. Since we are applying an event study, let's have a look at our timeline. On this slide, you can see the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic in Germany. And you can see the daily cases by reporting date, then a 7-day average over those daily cases. And again, the stringency index, we saw that in a previous presentation. And what the stringency index does, it captures the severity of containment and closures measures in place during this date. And what we can see here is that the number of infections started to rise in Germany during mid-March. And this is also when schools closed and social distance measures were introduced, lockdown curfews, and non-essential retail closed. So this is why we set the start of our event at March 13th. This is the day when national school closures were introduced. And what we then do is that the first observation within 30 days of this date is then considered as the observation at the time of the event. And what you can see here is that then after this first lockdown month, we see, or our data covers then 8 further 30 days intervals. So we also cover the time, which is here indicated by the green shading, when the number of infections was low and also at least some restrictions were partially lifted. And in the late fall, then Germany experienced a second COVID-19 wave. What you can see here is that numbers of infection increased again and new restrictions were introduced. So we see this as well. And but unfortunately, what we do not see is this peak in infection numbers at the turn of the year because we don't have a sufficient number of observations to analyze this as well. So what we do is we use an event study. This means basically that we measure our outcomes conditional on the point in time around the event. So we include monthly lags and leads, which are represented by the time variable, which you can see our empirical model on the slide. So as a reference level, we then use basically the 2019 level of well-being of the workers, and this should also take into account any seasonal effects that might occur regarding well-being. We control for individual fixed effects to take into account any time invariant individual characteristic like personality, which could also influence well-being. And we also add some control variables which can change over time, like marital status, if you belong to the COVID-19 risk group, or your highest level of education. So turning to our results, starting with mental health, we also refer to this as our depression score, and you can see this in the upper left corner. What you can see is that even prior to the lockdown, the depression score is already elevated compared to the intra-individual average. And this does not seem to be a seasonal effect. Rather, it seems to be that we see prospective effects of the pandemic when the first cases emerged in Germany in T=-2. And what we then see during this month of lockdown, then here the depression score peaks by about 6 points. And this is then followed by a gradual decline until T=4. And this is during this green shaded area when infection numbers were then low and restrictions were partly lifted. So you can see that people return to their baseline. And you can also see that during the second wave, which is here then marked again by this red area, that the depression score increases again, but however, not up to the same level as during the first lockdown. So, of course, this has to be interpreted with caution because unfortunately, we do not see the whole second wave. So it is possible that the depression score continued to increase after T=8. But at least what we see is that it does not increase to the same level as during the first lockdown. Turning to the satisfaction with life scale, we see that life satisfaction has only a small significant impact during the first month of lockdown. After that, we see a quick return to the baseline level and no significant deviation then after that. And if you have a closer look in our data, we actually see that this effect seems to be limited to the first fortnight of lockdown. So it's really a really short effect on satisfaction with life. On the bottom, you can see a momentary mood assessment for happy and unhappy. And when we look at the experienced happiness, we see that again, as the same with the depression score, experienced happiness is already negatively impacted before the lockdown was introduced and stays at a lower level during the lockdown and also at the second wave hit Germany. During this green shaded area, when infection numbers are low and some restrictions were lifted, you can see that people tend to enjoy their life as much as before COVID-19. So you can see adaptation between those waves of the pandemic. Looking at satisfaction with different life domains, starting with the satisfaction with job, we know this is an area where COVID-19 has brought about many changes like working from home and also increased job insecurities. So we see that this has had a negative impact on the satisfaction with job. We can see that COVID-19 has impacted so job satisfaction is decreased by about 2 points. This does not seem to be a large effect, but however, you can see that there is no adaptation between waves, so this seems to be a lasting effect. And this could be due to the fact that many restrictions in the working life continued even when other restrictions were lifted in this time. Turning to satisfaction with leisure, you can see that both the first wave and also the second wave decreased the satisfaction in this life domain by roughly 4 points. And we see not full adaptation between those waves, but at least some partial adaptation. So when some restrictions were lifted again. Turning to satisfaction with family life, we see a similar picture as with life satisfaction. There is only a small significant drop during the first lockdown, and after that we do not see a significant deviation from baseline. Interesting, when you look at satisfaction with the household chores, we see that a COVID-19 pandemic seems to have a positive impact on satisfaction with household chores. Especially if you look at the first and the second month after lockdown, we see that here actually there is a significant impact. And this could be due to the fact that when out of home leisure activities were severely restricted, that this caused a shift of focus onto domestic work like gardening or refurbishments. But however, this seems to be limited to the first wave, since we do not see this effect again at the start of the second wave. We also had a look if there are some differences between subgroups in our data, and in contrast to other studies, we do not find significant gender difference in the impact of the pandemic on well-being. However, what we do find that individuals who are in the German short-time work scheme and therefore work less hours per week, that they seem to suffer from a stronger decline in life satisfaction and also in mental health and also in job satisfaction. And this could, possible explanation for this could be that while short-time work protects those workers from large income losses and also from unemployment, that this could actually be perceived as an early sign of increased job insecurity, which then translates into a loss in well-being. But as comparable in other contexts, when people work less, their leisure satisfaction increases, and this is actually what happens here too. Looking at the COVID-19 risk group, I think it is possible, or to at least think that people who suffer from a higher risk of if they contract COVID-19, that they have a severe course, that they could be more severely impacted by the pandemic. But however, what we see is that people who belong to this risk group do not show any significant differences from other workers during the first lockdown. And if anything, we see that the second wave seems to have a less negative impact on their mental health and also on life and job satisfaction. So one possible explanation could be that those people actually benefit from those restrictions in place, like being able to work from home, or also like social distancing measures, like wearing face masks and so on.
2 more minutes, Julia.
Yeah, perfect. I'm at the conclusion slide. So what we did in our paper, we used novel monthly panel data of the same workers, and we showed or estimated the effect of the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown measures on the well-being of those German workers. And we were able to show that the first and also the second wave reduced workers' mental health substantially. We were also able to show that momentary happiness and satisfaction with life in general in different domains also declined, but to a smaller extent. Turning to subgroups, we see that women or individuals belonging to the COVID-19 risk group do not seem to suffer greater well-being losses. However, individuals in the German short-time work scheme are particularly negatively affected. Between those waves of COVID-19, we can see adaptation. This is then when infection rates fall and life returns to normal. However, for some indicators, namely satisfaction with job and also with leisure, we see that this adaptation seems to be incomplete. We also see that the second wave seems to have smaller well-being effects than the first wave, but as I already said, this has to be interpreted with caution because we do not see the whole second wave in our data. All in all, our results imply that the increased anxiety about the future and restricted personal freedoms are among the drivers of the well-being impact of the pandemic. So that is all, and I'm now looking forward to any comments or questions you might have.
Thank you. Then I give the floor to Carol, who is your discussant.
Thank you. And at least I finally managed to get myself on the session. Apologies for that delay. So first of all, this is a great, really comprehensive, very nicely done paper, and it's got an advantage couple of advantages over what's already out there, and there's plenty out there already on COVID. One is the data set in the sense of it across, you've got within person over time. There are very few papers that have both positive life course evaluation measures and the negative measures plus mental health all combined. And I think that's really important because as you look at the different papers, you see very much what they find, but never in one paper with data sets that all are one and the same and match each other. So the fact that life satisfaction is relatively flat. I mean, it drops a bit and then adapts, versus the mental health measures and the momentary measures move around much more. It's interesting as a point for COVID, but for the COVID shock, but it's also interesting as sort of a broader well-being issue that I think is worth some further study. Why do life evaluations why are life evaluations more protected by such a big shock when the more momentary measures and the ill-being measures are not? I don't think we really know the answer to that, but this paper is a good start. The data I'm going to show has some hints of that as well, how these things can coexist. But again, I think it would be nice to know more. There is one disadvantage of the data, and that's this sort of skewed sample of workers employed workers looking for work. I don't think that's a fatal flaw by any means. It's such a good data set, but I think it'd be nice to see in the paper a little more discussion of, one, the attrition bias that they note, which is that people either drop out in the first 3 months or they stay in the panel, but a little more on who drops out and who stays in would be useful. And also how this set of people looking for work, part of whom are expecting layoffs due to massive layoffs. I mean, it's all nicely explained, but how does this population group differ from the German population as a whole? I think it would be good to have in the paper, and I'm sure it's not a lot of work to get it since you already have the data. And then a broader comment, I think the paper could use a slightly better frame. It's speaking to big issues, and it spends a little more, for my preferences, it spends a little too much time on the details of each measure and each domain measure versus the big questions it's speaking to. And I think the paper could be framed by them. One of those is the issue of anxiety and uncertainty and how that affects well-being, and obviously seems to have differential effect on life course evaluations versus on ill-being measures. Why is that? I think that's a big question that the well-being literature should be able to answer eventually. And another question that's been out there for a long time is adaptation. So what do and don't people adapt to, right? I think this paper speaks to that, but doesn't take it on directly in a bigger picture way. You have clear patterns in adaptation in your data. People don't respond as much to the second wave. Do they get used to it? Do they get used to lockdowns? I think these are issues that, again, are worth taking the paper's findings and speaking to, and possibly framing the paper a bit around them. I think it would be more than of a contribution to general well-being literature, in addition to sort of a study of what were the effects on COVID, right? So it's a very positive comment in the sense that I'm just saying you could be speaking to bigger questions, and you should with the data that you have. And then a couple of findings that are particularly interesting and maybe could be made more of. One is the gender finding and how it compares to other findings on gender, which aren't the same. And quite a new finding is this finding that people who were already at risk of COVID, so presumably in worse health, benefited from the lockdowns. Their well-being increased because they felt somewhat protected, presumably, by those restrictions. Again, that's a under-discussed finding in the paper that's worth, I think, a bit more discussion. And again, I think it would be worth trading off, if you're worried about length, with some of the more detailed discussion about domains. I mean, those findings are interesting, but they could be in an appendix, and they're kind of much more expected. So again, a great paper. I would make more of the findings and speak to these bigger questions if you're planning to revise it. But thank you, and thanks for the chance to discuss it.
Would you like to briefly respond, Julia?
Well, a lot of comments, so really thank you for that. We really appreciate it, and I think we will at least take into account your comments. So really thank you for that.
Okay, then also to Julia it applies that if you have any more questions or comments for her, then you can use the chat. So now we go to our final presenter, and it's actually really nice that the final presentation of the conference is by the president of eSquals. So Carol.
Don't rub that in.
Yeah.
Okay, let me share my screen. I will try and be brief because I know that it's late, people are tired, and I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. This is it's joint work with Emily Dobson, who's now at Maryland doing her PhD, and Ethan Dodd, who was a very funny, very quirky intern with us this past year, who's moving on to do politics and not economics. So I guess we didn't impress him very much, but what can we do? In any event, I need to do slideshow, don't I? Hold on a second. Why can't I do this?
How do you need to go in to view?
Yeah, but I can't get up there because of the Zoom stuff is up there. Anyway,
okay.
This is fine.
You can the right bottom.
Yeah.
You have a bit more to the right. I don't know how to.
Oh,
yeah,
there.
Bottom. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Martijn. You've helped me too many times today. I owe you something. Beer mailed from the U.S. to Holland. But anyway, it's part of a bigger exploration we've been doing, which is trying to explore the potential of well-being metrics as warning indicators. I don't want to use the term predictive because I think that's overplaying our hand, but I do think the patterns that we found in past research are that, you know, the changes in well-being among particular cohorts are associated with changes in behavior or outcomes such as deaths of despair in the United States. And so we tried to take that same approach as we watched what we called a coincidence of public health crisis. So we already had an existing public health crisis of deaths of despair. About 70,000 Americans a year die of suicide, overdose, or other poisonings, primarily, not only less than college educated whites in their middle-aged years, but that's sort of the key cohort. It's been changing a little bit since COVID, but basically. And we showed that despair among these groups increased well before the deaths of despair. A paper that Kelsey and I wrote actually on optimism and longevity found that despair began to increase among less than college educated white men at the time of the first manufacturing falls in the US in the late 70s. And it was a time also that optimism started to increase among both African Americans and women because of civil rights and gender rights improving. So the metrics, and we've matched these at the level of county level death rates from the CDC data, the confidential data, and then individual level life satisfaction in the future, worry, stress. And the most important variable seems to be loss of hope. You know, no hope for the future is robustly associated with deaths of despair. That was in a paper we did called the Geography of Desperation. So what we do here is we look at where COVID coincides. First of all, it lands in a very deeply divided country. It's not pretty obvious to most observers of what's going on in the US now, divided in terms of opportunity, health, and hope. I've spent a lot of time documenting the divisions in hope, and it reflects in the million lives lost to deaths of despair in the past decade. And we explored the places and populations that were most vulnerable to COVID and where those coincide with vulnerability to deaths of despair, and try and use well-being metrics to explore the spillover effects on well-being from, you know, these additional shocks to places that already had low levels of well-being. And as I said earlier, we found that these metrics match robustly, and we really find a strong difference in levels of optimism and hope and stress across minorities and whites, particularly low-income African Americans and low-income whites, with the former being much more optimistic and less likely to die of deaths of despair than whites. And so we had some data challenges with COVID because CDC releases their data well over a year after it's collected, meaning we don't have good 2020 data on deaths of despair. And so we had to use first responder data from the national agency that collects it. So essentially calls for first responders for suicides, overdoses, and mental and behavioral reports, which are reports of, you know, you call because somebody's acting really weird on your street kind of thing. And try and use those compared to the patterns in 2019, 2018 to assess excess deaths of despair. And then we also look at changes in well-being, again, having to patch together different data sets because even though now Census Pulse is collecting well-being metrics, they're only collecting anxiety and depression and not life satisfaction, which is a huge lost opportunity and mistake. I've sent them comments and now they're saying they're going to do it in 2021, but that really doesn't help us because we're missing all of the 2020 trends in positive life satisfaction, which is why Julia and Clement's paper is so nice. I'm jealous of that data set. Anyway, let me keep going here. So as I mentioned before, you can see here, this is the odds of being in a higher level on an 11-point optimism scale, depending on racial group. Whites are the poor whites are the left out group. These are all low income groups, and poor blacks are about 3 times as likely to be up higher on that optimism scale. I've tried to make this finding go away so many times and it won't. It's incredibly persistent over time. It's persistent historically. It's persistent through Trump's election. It's persistent through the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's persistent during COVID. So there's much more to this. There are potentially even some genetic roots for this. It's certainly a resilience story of having adapted over time to a lot of discrimination. It's also a story of what I call communities of empathy, which minorities have and poor whites don't, of communities that support each other. It really is a puzzle if you think about the US context, but it's a remarkably persistent finding and linked to some better outcome as well. Not totally, but to some. So, so this is what was happening to the US before COVID. This was, if you look at, these are, you know, a bunch of rich countries, and the red line is US non-Hispanic whites, and the thick blue line in the middle is US Hispanic. So what you see is happening, if African Americans were on here, this isn't my data, if African Americans were on here, they would be going down with US Hispanics. So what you see from 1990 on, particularly from the year 2000 on, is that our mortality rate is going up rather than down, driven by these deaths of despair. And it's pretty remarkable how extensive the deaths are, that they could actually change our overall life expectancy rate, and they have. But what's interesting is that Hispanics and African Americans continue to go down on the same trend as the other rich countries versus poor US whites depart from that, and that's due to deaths of despair. So I already mentioned that we find that at the MSA and county level that CDC deaths of despair rates are negatively correlated with optimism, individual level optimism, and positively correlated with stress. I think this is two-way causality. If you live in a county where everybody's dying of suicide or overdose, it can't do a lot for your well-being, and a lot of despair and stress is more likely to lead to these kinds of deaths. So what we did is we added in COVID death rates into our regressions and work, both using the former CDC data set and then the Hopkins COVID tracker, some new well-being data from a Gallup panel that's unfortunately not very balanced, a joint survey that I ran with WashU, and then the EMS first responder data. If you want to look at this stuff on a map, there's a link to our interactive indicator, a vulnerability indicator at the county level for the US that runs through 2020. We need to update it post 2020. And what's interesting, initially in COVID, the deaths, COVID hit the opposite of the white cohort vulnerable to deaths of despair. It hit Blacks and Hispanics, optimistic minorities in the cities because they were essential workers. And so we initially see that COVID is negatively correlated at the county level, COVID with deaths of despair, but that changed over time. So I'm going to skip over some of this detail. You can see it in the paper. I mentioned we have new well-being data, this national emergency medical health services, first responder data, and some other work we've been doing with these comparisons. So what we did, our main dependent variable is the rate of COVID deaths per 100,000 people per county. We used both OLS and this pseudo-Poisson maximum likelihood thing, PPML, which just allowed us to include counties that had 0 deaths of December 31st, 2020. I don't know if there are many of counties with no COVID deaths now, but by the end of 2020, it was about 40 counties, and we didn't want to exclude them, thinking that would lead to bias. So the PPML produces elasticities rather than log specifications. We get fairly similar results for both OLS and PPML. And then we control for share of Blacks, Hispanics, share of the population. I can't see what that is. I don't know. Share of the population on disability, I think. Metro adjacent markers for counties, because counties near cities are much more like cities than plain rural counties. Poverty and unemployment rates, population density, the number of ICU beds, all sorts of stuff. There's our specification. And so what did we find? So the strongest positive association with COVID deaths were % of Black inhabitants. None of this is surprising, the population over 65, and the incidence rate of COVID. That's not surprising. One thing that is more surprising is that we found no significant coefficients on poverty or unemployment rates. And it's probably because COVID incidence may not, it may not reflect these indicators. One, because people may live in one county and commute and work to another. So essential workers who are more likely to get COVID may live in poorer counties, but commute to wealthier counties. We're not really sure. We do find that county level household income is negatively correlated with COVID deaths because the wealthy are less vulnerable, but it's not completely a poverty and unemployment rate story. Also, some of the counties with high rates of poverty and low and high unemployment rates are not very population dense. So then again, that may help explain it. We do find that the share of Trump voters is positively correlated with COVID. So these were counties that had experienced economic decline. And I think it's also, I think it also may have to do with the kind of social distancing behaviors, mask wearing, other things that are eschewed by Republican politicians. It's stupid as it is, and it seems to correlate with higher levels of COVID deaths. People still vote for these morons. But anyway, share of Trump voters positively correlated with COVID deaths. And then we find that this negative correlation between county level COVID death rates and deaths of despair in early 2020 changed markedly as the pandemic spread countywide, especially to suburban and rural areas where deaths of despair are more prevalent and hospitals are very scarce. We have a rural health crisis in the United States. So when these places did get COVID, there was a shortage of hospital beds and ICU beds, and people had to go as far as 2 hours away to get to a hospital that was already overwhelmed. So that exposed the extent to which the US is partially becoming a third world country. And our healthcare system is just very skewed and very unequal. So the one thing we found, though, is that we didn't get any big significant coefficient either on counties with high rates of deaths of despair. They didn't seem to be more susceptible to COVID than others, which surprised, I mean, the negative coefficient disappeared, but we didn't get a positive coefficient as expected on the deaths of despair kinds of counties. It may be that they already had high levels of deaths And therefore, it could be that people who might have gotten COVID were dying of suicide or overdose. You know, we don't fully know, but I think that's probably likely if you see, which I'll show you in a second, the extent of overdose death rates with COVID. So again, we looked at these well-being trends, both with first responder data and also then the Gallup panel. What we find with the EMS data, so we found that suicide first increased and then declined in 2020, which people think is a puzzle, but I don't think it's a puzzle, because at the same time, overdoses show a 30% increase in overdose deaths in 2020 compared to 2019. We got the same estimate from the NEMSIS data, and then after we did that, the CDC released their preliminary data showing almost exactly the same thing, which gave us confidence that our EMS NEMSIS data was actually a pretty good proxy. So we find a huge increase in overdose deaths and in mental and behavioral health reports, and suicide sort of upticking and then kind of flattening out again. But I think that's also because with overdose deaths, it's very difficult to know if they're intentional or not, right? Some are not intentional. Fentanyl, a very powerful opioid, has entered the system and people are dying of it unintentionally. But you can imagine during COVID, the vulnerable cohorts might increase in intentional overdoses, but we can't tell because they are classified as an overdose death, and there's no way of finding out if it was a suicide or an overdose death. So you get suicides go down, but overdose deaths go up dramatically. It's hard to say they're not correlated. So both the panel data, the census pulse data, show significant increases in ill-being and depression. That fits with the data that Julia reported for Germany. There was a kind of similar pattern with a recovery after the first lockdown period and then an uptick again in the fall as the virus spikes back up. At the same time, you get these higher levels of optimism among low-income Blacks persisting. They coexist with increases in anxiety. We find low-income whites are still the most likely to report depression during the time period, in keeping with the pre-existing trends of deaths of despair. But we do see an increase in anxiety and depression among Blacks and Hispanics, starting from much lower levels. But again, I think this is a bit of a puzzle that I'd love to see more traction on in the well-being literature, how these sort of some markers of ill-being, such as anxiety, can increase, and yet people still retain quite positive and stable levels of life evaluations and life evaluations for the future. So I can't answer the question. I think we need to know more about it. And then our other data, other well-being data with WashU, confirms again this remarkable consistency and optimism among low-income minorities, despite increases in anxiety. So very quickly, and then I'll stop. Here are the excess deaths of despair. The yellow line is 2019 to 2020 compared to the previous years, and you get an almost doubling. It's the CDC data is 30%. We thought it was like about a 40% increase based on these first responder calls, but pretty close. But it's a remarkable amount of overdose deaths. I mean, if you already had roughly almost 70,000 of them and you go up to 95,000 of them the next year, that's a lot of people who aren't dying from COVID, but in addition to because of the COVID shock, are dying of despair-related deaths. Here's mental and behavioral calls also go up quite a bit. Just so you see the trends, these are raw trends in anxiety without controls. With controls, Blacks report even lower levels of anxiety. But again, you see the minorities go up a fair amount, but then fall down below whites. Sort of later in the year, we only had through June of 21 at this point. If you had controls for income and other things, the minorities come in much lower. But there is a change. There's starting to be a change in minority well-being that we also need to learn more about. Depression rates, the same thing. Hispanics are really the ones with the highest rates. Hispanics actually suffered in some ways more than Blacks. I'm not trying to downplay anybody's suffering during COVID because a lot of them are illegally and they're undocumented immigrants. They weren't eligible for the support systems like the CARES Act and the other things that gave people some sort of money and way to get through COVID when they were unemployed. And then in addition, it was in the midst of a very anti-immigrant verbiage coming from the Trump administration. So I think both of those really impacted Hispanic well-being. This is the Gallup panel, which is slightly unstable in how they did their sampling over time. But again, you see pretty much a story of consistency. Life satisfaction is the bottom, and life satisfaction in the future, and those are by pulse weeks. You know, I think there's some dips and then some upticks, but essentially the overall levels remain the same over time. These are low income. These are life satisfaction and hope for the future among Black, whites, and Hispanics throughout the course of the pandemic. We had data for April through November 2020 at that point. And as you can see, low income Blacks are the highest, both on, Blacks are the highest on life satisfaction, but low income Blacks are much higher than low income whites. And if you look at the life status, oops, I just flipped. Wait a minute, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. If you look at the differences in life satisfaction 5 years in the future, again, the Blacks and particularly low income Blacks are much more optimistic than other races. This is self-reported mental health. Again, Blacks score better than both whites and Hispanics. To the extent that self-reported mental health, it's a pretty general question. I don't think it's a great question. I think it reflects the same optimism bias. But we also found that that for the optimism and mental health findings, if we looked at people who had the subsample of people who lost their job due to COVID, again, Blacks who were much more likely to lose their jobs were more optimistic than whites. So again, a dichotomy between what's happening to reported ill-being and reported positive well-being. And that's it. I don't think I don't need to repeat myself. My conclusions basically said what I just said, so it'll give back a little bit of time.
Thank you, Carol. Then we go to your discussants, which is Kelsey.
Yes, I think we're out of time, right? So
yeah, it's fine. Jill told me that there's no time cap on this session, so for whoever needs to go, please feel free to go. But we can go to the discussant comments and then the general discussion.
Well, so what I'll do though is I think, Carol, I'm just going to present one slide and then maybe we can discuss further. The paper is fairly preliminary, and so there's a lot of refinement that will come, I'm sure. So I don't need to discuss any details. One thing that's amazing is the amount of data, and so I think that there's the potential for a few papers here, and in writing a few papers, it would improve some of the focus. And so the one thing I'll mention right now is this is going to be on this slide. So I'm wondering if, are you interested in the rates in which counties contract and die from the disease, which is in my mind, the natural question, or given different COVID-19 infection rates, which counties suffer greater death rates? Because what you're doing is you're controlling for the infection rates. And I think that, certain quote unquote policy variables are more relevant for, these different questions. So perhaps certain demographic groups are more likely to die given, infection rates, but then you remove some of the behavioral questions, I think. So Trump voters may be more likely to contract the virus due to, let's say, behavior, such as adherence to lockdown measures, wearing masks, these other things. And, and then there's no reason for me to believe that they're going to have differential death rates given the infection rates, unless you believe that they have different health outcomes beforehand, which maybe they do if they have different levels of education, et cetera. But so I think right now.
Oh, sorry, they are a lot more likely to smoke and to be overweight.
Okay.
They are more, or at least as vulnerable as low-income minorities. So,
but for me, that's interesting, but I like the behavioral aspect more, than the, so the initial, let's say, selection. So right now, if you're focusing on, let's say, differential death rates, for me, a lot of times that's about things that we can't change so easily after the fact. But one thing that we can influence perhaps is individuals' behavior. So what I'm interested in is then the infection rates, the incidence, and it's going to be a mediator in your analysis. So you find that previous deaths of despair may not be related to COVID-19 deaths because the factors affecting both death rates are mediated by behavior and infection rates. So by controlling for infection rates, you are also to some extent controlling for behavior and eliminating one of the channels through which deaths of despair could be related to COVID-19 deaths.
That's a really good point. So we probably controlled out the most interesting thing we're interested in.
I think so. So basically, then the remainder of my comments are that you have a lot here, and if you can narrow your focus, you can find you're going to give it a little bit better. So thinking about narrowing your focus is going to make it easier to think about which control variables to include and which not to. So if you have one particular quote policy variable, it'll help you think about what other controls to include or not include. And right now, so you're talking about deaths in the paper as well as well-being outcomes. And for me, it's not clear. I mean, so death is one well-being outcome, but it's not clear why you need to look at both in the same paper. And one of the findings was essentially that I think it's the elasticity on Trump voters was 1. So a 1% increase in the number of Trump voters, the population share of Trump voters, leads to an equivalent increase in the deaths. So you've got some startling magnitudes in there too, I think. And so I think narrowing the focus a little bit will help you be able to look at this a little more clearly. Maybe the paper should be about Trump voters, just as an example. So that's all.
No, that's super helpful. It's like anytime you have all these different data sets trying to weave through what you really find, that's why this kind of comment is so valuable. And it's same, I guess, I felt about the previous paper also. There was so much in there, but there were some big questions that could get more focus.
Yeah.
Will you send me these, please?
Yeah, of course. And it's clear there too that you even have more papers. You've got so many in the pipeline. You reference these other papers now. Okay, yeah, sorry, I will stop there.
Okay, is there someone with a question? Then you can raise your virtual hand or a comment. Yes, Daniela.
Actually, I build on Kelsey's comment because I'm thinking, and it's a spontaneous reaction. I don't know if my intuitive thinking it will make sense. I'm thinking about these Trump voters and the correlation with that. I'm thinking into that perspective. If poor people cannot have access to facilities in United States, and they are into the end of their life, and they are. It might be some kind of proxy. I'm thinking into that perspective. That might be that it is an amount of a percentage of people who were at the end of the life, and people are dying, and also at the end of the life in these risk groups. Which when they die perhaps of corona, but corona, the virus only come faster. They will die anyway. But anyway, I want to say that perhaps it's not such that we should leave it. I'm not rejecting what Kelsey was presenting. I'm only thinking about this issue about why some people vote. They are hoping for something to be better, and perhaps I don't know the mechanism, but I don't know if you got the point. I only want to suggest that this the characteristics of the voters and connected to the death might tell us something more into what Carol was presenting about behavior. Thank you. I don't know if you got what I want to say.
I did. I mean, I think, yeah, I can't answer all of it, obviously, because of the time, but I do think there's a difference between kind of hope without agency, which is what Trump voters had in believing, you know, make America great again. It was just a false promise and obviously one, versus hope with agency, which is much more characteristic of the hope of low-income minorities, you know, because they're not Pollyannas at all. If the same very optimistic respondents are not satisfied with their financial situation, they want to help their community, the characteristics and their behaviors are very distinct from that of sort of really desperate white Trump voters.
Actually, I didn't have any question. It was mostly like maybe one should look more careful into the mechanism and to identify a mechanism, because it seems that it is interesting correlation what you identify there. That was my comment, and it was very much inspired by Kelsey's comment. I didn't think before hearing his suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. There seem to be no more questions. So I think then this will be the end of the session, actually the real end of the conference then. So thank you all for your participation and in these special sessions. And yeah.
Thanks for organizing them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Martijn.
No problem.
Yeah, and thanks for the comments.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Kelsey.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send you an email.
Thank you, all of you. Stay safe and see you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Take care.
Enfermo.
Yeah, thanks all presenters and Martijn for putting it all together.
No thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Carol, is there a paper? Like,
Yeah, there's a paper. Do you want me to send it to you?
yeah.
Okay, sure. I will do.
Can I
It's
also
work
bother
in
you?
progress. It's very much work in progress, but I will send it.
Can I also quickly bother you with one very nitty-gritty question?
Sure.
On the optimism that's so strikingly large with the Black populace, and you've pointed this out before, I think. Is it also true about the recalled well-being of Blacks in the US, that they are overly optimistic, or is it just future looking?
I have a new survey in the field of Black adolescents, low income versus white versus Black adolescents in poor neighborhoods. And I don't see that they're over optimistic in their as they assess their well-being. We asked them how where they were 5 years ago on the ladder, where they are now, and where they will be. And they're typically much more optimistic about the future than the past, for sure. They're higher on the ladder than low-income whites are currently as well. They also tend to be realistic about, so they have aspirations, but they're realistic about their current situation. So that's why, and we had one little subsample of the Gallup Healthways before they discontinued it, where we were able to look at low-income Black optimistic respondents over time. It was a little panel, and we saw that they did better over the time period than non-optimistic respondents. Maybe not hugely better, but a little bit better, remembering they're not in very good shape. So I don't know if that really answers why you're asking the question, but that's sort of what I can tell you.
The motivation was just, is it just a general cognitive bias of just,
No. Oh, I see. Yeah, no. And I've been trying to explore through different questions to make sure they're not just Pollyannas, right? That they're hopeful, whatever happens. And I think that's why it's also interesting to see anxiety increase and reported depression increase, and yet the optimism remains. So they're obviously realistic about what's going on, and yet there's a certain, whether it's determination or optimism, and some of it may be honestly, the reason I mentioned genetics, I've been trying to understand this a bit more and looking at other studies, but it may be a survival thing, you know, as genes evolve over time and populations have to face consistent adversity and discrimination over time, that there's a gene transmitter that carries higher levels of serotonin. Whites are more likely than blacks to have the low allele, and it's the long allele that seems to be protective of negative events resulting in depression. I can't say I know a lot about it, but that's certainly provocative, and it sort of fits with the empirical findings and the reports. So I risk treading on very difficult territory that I don't know much about, but I certainly, it's so weird how that genetic finding and what you see over the course of history for African Americans versus low-income whites is remarkable. And there's this historical book by a woman at Yale called Nancy, I've forgotten her last name, but it's called White Trash, the 400-year Untold History of Underclass in America. And it's about how post-slavery, poor whites were considered to be much less resilient, much more likely to get sick, and much less efficient in work than were previous slaves who are now free workers or whatever. And so that there's this long kind of unknown component of history of kind of underprivileged whites who have not fared very well over time. I don't know, you know, again, it's all provocative, but I don't have the answers.
Yeah, definitely hugely filled up with tension as soon as you get into the gene territory. But
oh yeah,
I think
absolutely.
a study well done would be much appreciated.
Yeah, well, maybe I have to take a very cautious stab at that.
Yeah. One final thing, and then I'm going to be silent. The absolute depression rates were enormous. Like not, they're very high. I thought the trends, okay, the trends are the trends, and then the population differences, okay, fair enough. But the absolute levels,
the absolute levels are like enormous.
35%.
Going right, I mean, just a huge change from, like, for blacks it was 7% the year before, you know, so it's a giant rise. But you know, the other thing is that's just a raw data over time, and there's so many other things going on. The Trump, you know, the Trump re-election campaign, Black Lives Matter, you know, it was a tumultuous year in history, so it's hard to, you know, I guess you have to be cautious about blaming it all to COVID, but you know, COVID was pretty awful, particularly for the low-income populations of all races. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you, though.
All right. Well, and hope to see you in Oxford in October.
Yeah. So do I.
Is Milena still there, or is she hiding?
She might be hiding.
I think she's hiding.
I think all the people are hiding now.
Yeah.
So,
oh well. Time to close. I'll write her separately. So.
I'll have dinner then.
What?
I'll have dinner then.
Okay, great. I haven't even had lunch yet, but there's a time change for you.
All right.
Bye. Bye. Thanks for the great questions. Bye, everyone. Bye, Talita. If you can hear, I know you have a windstorm.
Thank you.